The gunshot wound in his side would kill him by morning, and Thomas Mercer knew it. He collapsed against the door of the only lit building in the settlement, a forge still burning at midnight, and when the door opened, he fell into the arms of a woman who had every reason to let him die. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and 3 years ago, Thomas had sent her brother to prison for a crime he didn't commit. Elena dragged him inside, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the shock coursing through her veins. She recognized him instantly, those same cold eyes that had testified against Miguel, now glazed with fever and pain. Her fingers found the wound. A bullet lodged deep beneath his ribs, and she faced a choice that would define everything that followed. Let him die and call it justice, or save him and betray the memory of her brother who hanged himself in that prison cell. She chose the harder path. The bullet came out after an hour of surgery by firelight, Thomas unconscious and trembling, Elena's steady hands pulling metal from flesh with tools meant for shoeing horses. She cauterized the wound with a heated iron, the same way she'd learned from her father, the same forge where she now worked alone after losing everything. When Thomas finally opened his eyes 2 days later, the first word he spoke was her name, and the weight of recognition nearly crushed them both. He tried to leave that first morning, fever-weak and stumbling, but Elena blocked the door with crossed arms and iron resolve. She told him plainly he would stay until he could ride, not out of mercy but because she refused to have his death on her conscience the way his testimony had marked hers with grief. Thomas sank back onto the cot, understanding that this woman's strength was forged in fires far hotter than any she tended in her workshop. The days that followed were thick with silence and unspoken recrimination. Elena worked the forge while Thomas healed, the ring of hammer on anvil filling the hours they couldn't bear to speak. She brought him food without ceremony, changed his bandages without gentleness, and each act of care was shaded with the bitterness of old wounds reopened. Thomas watched her work, watched the way she moved with her father's precision, and began to understand what his testimony had truly taken from her. On the 7th day, Thomas broke the silence with 3 words that changed everything. He told her Miguel was innocent, that he'd known it even then, that he'd been forced to lie by men who threatened to burn her family's ranch to ashes if he refused. The confession hung between them like smoke, and Elena's hands stilled on the bellows, her entire body rigid with a rage so pure it threatened to consume them both. She didn't strike him, didn't scream, didn't throw him into the street to bleed out his remaining days. Instead, she asked him one question: who were the men? Thomas gave her 3 names, names that meant power in this territory, names that had built empires on lies and violence. And in that moment, Elena understood that her choice to save his life had opened a door to something far more dangerous than simple revenge. Thomas offered her the only thing he had left, his gun hand and his knowledge of those men's operations. He'd been their hired blade for 5 years, collecting debts and silencing problems, until he'd tried to walk away and they'd put a bullet in him as payment. Now he was a dead man either way, killed by infection or killed by their hunters when they found him. But if Elena wanted justice for Miguel, real justice, he could help her take it. The offer should have been refused, should have been spat back in his face along with demands he leave and never return. But Elena had spent 3 years shoeing horses and mending plows, swallowing her grief, watching those same men ride through town with their wealth and arrogance. She'd lost her brother, her father's legacy, and her faith in any justice except the kind forged by her own hands. She accepted. And their unlikely alliance was sealed, not with words, but with Elena handing Thomas his gun belt, the leather still stiff with his dried blood, and telling him he would earn his redemption or die trying. Before we continue, if you're enjoying Thomas and Elena's story of redemption in the Wild West, take a moment to hit that like button. It helps us share these tales with more listeners who appreciate cinematic storytelling. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're listening from. Whether it's a quiet evening at home, a long drive through your own frontier, or anywhere this story finds you. We love hearing from our community across the globe. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. We bring you new Western tales every day, stories of courage, redemption, and the human spirit tested by the unforgiving frontier. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's return to the forge, where Thomas and Elena's dangerous alliance is about to deepen. Thomas spent 3 weeks regaining his strength, working alongside Elena in the forge to rebuild muscles wasted by fever. She taught him the rhythm of the hammer, the way heat transformed metal from rigid to malleable. And Thomas began to understand that this woman wielded her tools with the same deadly precision he'd once reserved for firearms. They worked in careful synchrony, Elena shaping horseshoes while Thomas mended wagon wheels, and slowly the distance between them began to narrow. He told her about the men, Marcus Dalton, who owned the cattle company, Sheriff Wade Hutchins, who enforced Dalton's will, and a land speculator named Vernon Cross, who bought properties at gunpoint prices. They'd built a machine that consumed homesteads and honest men alike, and Thomas had been one of their sharpest teeth. Miguel had owned water rights they wanted, and when he wouldn't sell, they'd manufactured a rustling charge and used Thomas's testimony to seal his fate. Elena listened, her face carved from stone. And when Thomas finished, she told him about Miguel's last letter. Her brother had written about the lies, about his certainty that truth would eventually surface, about his faith that Elena would survive and thrive despite everything. He'd asked her to forgive, to move forward, to build something good from the ashes of their loss. Then he'd hanged himself with his bedsheet, unable to endure another day of injustice. The letter had burned in Elena's hands like hot iron, and she'd carried its weight every day since. Forgiveness seemed impossible. Moving forward a betrayal, but building something good that she understood. She'd kept the forge alive, kept her father's craft breathing, and now she would use those same skills to dismantle the machine that had devoured her family. Their plan began with information. Thomas knew the routes Dalton's men used to move stolen cattle, the schedules of payroll shipments, the hidden accounts where Vernon Cross kept his illegal earnings. He drew maps in the dirt floor of the forge, marking locations and timing, while Elena committed everything to memory with the same focus she brought to remembering the exact temperature needed for tempering steel. They would start small, disrupting a cattle shipment, making Dalton's operation unprofitable, creating cracks in the foundation of his empire. Thomas knew the terrain, knew where the drive would be most vulnerable, and Elena had contacts among the ranchers Dalton had squeezed nearly dry. Together they could organize resistance, turn victims into allies, and build something stronger than any individual revenge. But first they needed proof, something concrete that tied Dalton to the manufactured charges against Miguel and a dozen other men whose land he'd acquired through legal theft. Thomas knew where Dalton kept his records, a safe in his ranch house office, protected by guards and distance. Getting inside would require more than planning. It would require the kind of desperate courage that got men killed. Elena suggested an alternative, one that made Thomas's blood run cold. She would go to the ranch under the pretense of shoeing their horses, a service she'd provided before Miguel's arrest, when her reputation was still intact. She could map the interior, locate the safe, and identify weaknesses in their security. Thomas argued against it, argued that the risk was too great, but Elena reminded him with quiet fury that she'd been taking risks every day since her brother's death. He relented, knowing that her determination was absolute, and spent 3 days teaching her everything he knew about moving through hostile territory. How to read men's intentions from their posture, how to memorize details without appearing to observe, how to create diversions and exploit moments of carelessness. Elena absorbed it all, her mind as sharp as any blade she'd ever forged. The morning she left for Dalton's ranch, Thomas watched her ride away with a tightness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He realized with uncomfortable clarity that Elena Vasquez had become more than an unlikely ally. She'd become someone whose survival mattered to him in ways that complicated everything. He returned to the forge and worked the bellows harder than necessary, trying to burn away the growing fear that he'd sent her into danger he should have faced himself. Elena returned after sunset, her face carefully neutral but her hands trembling slightly as she unsaddled her horse. Thomas waited in the forge. The fire banked low, and when she finally entered, she spoke in a rush of controlled urgency. She'd mapped the entire first floor, located the safe behind a painting in Dalton's office, and counted 8 guards who rotated in shifts. But she'd also seen something that changed the scope of their mission entirely. Vernon Cross had been there, meeting with Dalton and Sheriff Hutchins, and their conversation had been about expansion. They weren't content with their current holdings. They wanted the entire valley, every ranch, every farm, every water source from the mountains to the trading routes. Elena had lingered near a window while working, pretending to check a horse's hoof, and caught fragments that painted a picture of systematic elimination. There was a list. Cross had pulled it from his satchel and spread it across Dalton's desk. Names of property owners marked for removal. Some would be bought with pressure. Some would face manufactured legal troubles like Miguel. And some, Cross had tapped specific names with his finger, would simply disappear. Elena's own name had been on that list, marked for acquisition by year's end. Thomas felt the old familiar darkness rise in his chest, the part of him that had once made him valuable to men like Dalton. But now that darkness was tempered by something else, a protectiveness that focused his rage into something sharp and purposeful. Elena had walked into the heart of their enemy's stronghold, had risked everything to gather intelligence, and now they knew the full scope of the threat they faced. They couldn't simply disrupt operations or steal documents. They needed to dismantle the entire conspiracy before it consumed the valley. That meant exposing Dalton's crimes publicly, bringing in federal marshals, and protecting every name on that list until justice could be served. It was ambitious to the point of impossible, but Thomas had built a career on impossible tasks, and Elena's determination made even desperation feel achievable. They began by reaching out to other names on the list. Careful meetings in Elena's forge after dark. Quiet conversations about collective defense. Many were skeptical. Thomas Mercer's reputation preceded him, and his sudden alliance with Elena raised questions about his motives. But Elena vouched for him, spoke about his confession and his offer of redemption, and slowly the skeptics became willing to listen. A circuit preacher named Josiah Webb was the first to fully commit. His small church sat on land Vernon Cross wanted for a rail spur, and Webb had already received threats disguised as generous offers. He brought moral authority and connection to families throughout the valley, and his involvement legitimized their resistance in ways Thomas's gun skills never could. Webb looked at Thomas with eyes that had witnessed countless confessions, and told him that redemption was earned through service, not simply sought through declaration. Thomas accepted the weight of those words, understanding that every action moving forward would be measured against the harm he'd caused. Miguel's death was a debt that could never be fully repaid, but perhaps he could prevent others from joining that tally. He threw himself into planning with the focus of a man who had finally found purpose beyond survival. Elena organized the forge into a command center, maps on the walls, supply lists and guard rotations noted in careful script. She worked through the nights, her hands moving between hammer and pen with equal precision, and Thomas found himself watching her with growing admiration. This woman who should have let him die had instead forged him into something better than he'd been, a weapon aimed not at the innocent but at the corrupt. Their first action came 2 weeks later, a coordinated effort to document Dalton's cattle operation. Ranchers on the list took positions along known rustling routes, noting brands and movements, while Josiah Webb's network spread word to honest lawmen in neighboring territories. They gathered evidence of systematic theft, hundreds of head of cattle bearing forged brands, and prepared to present it to a federal marshal making rounds 3 months hence. But Dalton noticed the increased scrutiny, noticed his operations under observation, and sent men to ask questions. They came to Elena's forge one afternoon, 3 of them, ostensibly to have horses shod but really to intimidate and assess. Thomas stayed hidden in the back room, gun ready, while Elena faced them with the same calm she brought to tempering steel. She answered their veiled threats with practical deflection, showed them her account books proving her business was legitimate, and sent them away unsatisfied, but without clear cause for action. The confrontation at the forge marked a turning point, a shift from gathering intelligence to active conflict. Dalton's men began watching Elena's property, noting visitors, tracking movements. Thomas and Elena adapted, meeting their allies in different locations, using the vast emptiness of the frontier to hide their coordination. But the pressure was building, and everyone involved understood that their window for action was narrowing.
Sheriff Hutchins made his move on a cold morning in late autumn. He arrived at the forge with a warrant for Thomas's arrest, claiming new evidence in an old robbery case. The charge was fabricated. Thomas had been working for Dalton during that robbery, had an alibi that would expose the sheriff's connections if examined honestly. But Hutchins had no intention of letting the case reach trial. He simply wanted Thomas removed from the equation.
Elena stepped between the sheriff and Thomas, her voice steady as hammered iron. She demanded to see the evidence, questioned the timing of charges after Thomas had been living openly in her forge for months, and made it clear that any arrest would be contested publicly. Hutchins smiled, the cold smile of a man who held power and knew it, and told her that defending a known killer would destroy what little reputation she had left. Thomas started to surrender, to accept arrest and spare Elena further trouble. But she stopped him with a hand on his arm and eyes that burned with absolute resolve. She told Hutchins that if he wanted Thomas, he'd need a federal warrant reviewed by impartial authority, and until then she was exercising her right to refuse unlawful seizure on her property. The legal language was precise. Josiah Webb had coached her, and Hutchins found himself momentarily outmaneuvered. The sheriff left with threats, promised he'd return with whatever authority necessary. And the moment his horse disappeared from sight, Elena turned to Thomas with grim determination. They had perhaps 2 days before Hutchins manufactured sufficient legal cover, which meant their timeline had just collapsed from months to hours. Everything they'd planned would need to happen immediately, or not at all. Thomas sent word to their allies through a network of trusted riders, called them to assemble that night at Webb's church. Elena closed the forge, packed documents and evidence into saddlebags, and prepared for the possibility they might not return. She stood in her father's workshop, hands resting on the anvil he'd used for 40 years, and made peace with whatever came next. This forge had been her sanctuary, her connection to family and memory. But some things mattered more than preservation. 23 people gathered in Webb's church as midnight approached. Ranchers and farmers, shopkeepers and widows, all with names on Vernon Cross's list. Thomas stood before them, this man who'd been their enemy, and laid out the situation with brutal honesty. Hutchins was coming for him, which meant Dalton knew they were organizing, which meant everyone in this room was now at risk of facing manufactured charges or worse. He gave them a choice: walk away now and hope for mercy, or commit fully to exposing the conspiracy before it destroyed them individually. Several families left, fear overriding courage, and Thomas didn't blame them. What remained were 15 souls willing to bet everything on a desperate plan. 15 people who understood that survival sometimes required accepting impossible ODDS. Josiah Webb spoke next, his preacher's voice carrying weight beyond his slight frame. He reminded them of biblical David facing Goliath, of faith proven through action, of the moral imperative to resist evil even when resistance seemed futile. His words weren't empty comfort. They were steel reinforcing already present courage. And when he finished, the room hummed with grim determination. Elena outlined the plan. 3 simultaneous actions designed to expose and disrupt Dalton's operation. One group would raid his cattle-holding pens. release hundreds of head-bearing forged brands, and drive them toward neighboring territories where honest lawmen could document the theft. A second group would break into Cross's office, seize his financial records proving illegal land acquisitions, and deliver them to the territorial governor. The third group, Thomas, Elena, and two ranch hands named Cooper and Martinez, would infiltrate Dalton's ranch house and open his safe. Inside were the documents Elena had seen, the lists and correspondence proving conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. Those documents were the keystone, the proof that would make everything else undeniable. It was audacious, likely to get some or all of them killed, but inaction guaranteed a slower death as Dalton's machine ground through the valley. They would strike tomorrow night, using a planned social gathering at Dalton's ranch as cover. Vernon Cross was hosting potential investors, showing off the valley he intended to control, and security would be focused on protecting wealthy visitors rather than watching for infiltration. Thomas spent the day before the raid teaching Elena to shoot. They rode to a canyon miles from town, where gunfire wouldn't draw attention, and he placed a pistol in her hands for the first time. She held it awkwardly, this woman whose tools had always been for creation rather than destruction. But Thomas was patient. He showed her stance and grip, explained breathing and trigger control, and watched as she transformed uncertainty into competence through sheer determination. She would never be fast, would never match his reflexes honed by years of violence, but by afternoon she could hit a target at 20 paces. More importantly, she understood when not to shoot, how to read situations and make calculated decisions under pressure. Thomas realized he was training her not to be a gunfighter, but to be a survivor. Teaching her skills, he prayed she'd never need but couldn't let her face tomorrow without possessing. They talked while riding back, conversation flowing more easily than it had since his arrival. Elena asked about his life before Dalton, before he'd become someone who testified falsely and took money for intimidation. Thomas told her about a ranch in Colorado, parents lost to disease, a younger sister married off to a man in Kansas. He'd drifted after losing the ranch to debt, fallen into work that paid well and demanded moral compromise. And by the time he understood what he'd become, it was too late to unmake those choices. But Elena's intervention had given him something unexpected, a chance to rebuild himself into someone his sister wouldn't be ashamed to know. He spoke about writing to her after this was finished, about trying to reconnect with the family he'd abandoned. Elena listened without judgment, her profile sharp against the setting sun, and Thomas felt a longing he'd thought dead stir somewhere behind his ribs. That night they reviewed the plan one final time, coordinates and timing, backup strategies and escape routes. Cooper and Martinez arrived after dark, hard men who'd lost property to Dalton's schemes and welcomed the chance for justice. They deferred to Thomas's experience, accepted Elena's leadership, and prepared their equipment with grim efficiency. Elena found Thomas alone in the forge near midnight, the fire cold for the first time in months. She stood in the doorway watching him check his weapons. This ritual of violence he'd performed countless times before. But tonight was different. Tonight he fought for something beyond survival or coin, and Elena understood that transformation was happening before her eyes. She crossed the room, placed her hand over his, and spoke words that needed saying before dawn arrived. She told him Miguel would have approved, would have recognized that redemption requires action and risk. Her brother had believed in second chances, had written about forgiveness in that final letter, and Elena had finally begun to understand what he'd meant. Allowing Thomas to earn redemption didn't betray Miguel's memory. It honored his faith in human capacity for change. Thomas turned to face her, seeing in her eyes something beyond alliance or shared purpose. There was trust, hard-earned and carefully built, and beneath it something more dangerous. He'd fallen in love with Elena Vasquez somewhere between her saving his life and her forging him into someone worthy of that salvation. He wanted to speak those feelings, to name them before riding into probable death. But words failed beneath the weight of everything unsaid. Elena understood anyway, reached up to touch his face with hands calloused by hammer and tongs, and told him they would survive tomorrow because survival was the only acceptable outcome. They'd fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let Dalton's corruption end them. She kissed him once, brief but absolute, a promise that what they'd begun would continue beyond tomorrow's violence. They left before dawn. 4 riders moving through darkness toward different destinies. The other groups were already in position, waiting for the signal. And Thomas felt the familiar coldness settle over him. This was what he'd been trained for. Violence in service of objectives. But now the objectives were just, and the violence necessary. He glanced at Elena riding beside him, her face set with determination, and drew strength from her unwavering courage. Dalton's ranch blazed with lights, the social gathering in full swing. Wealthy men and their wives mingled on the veranda, servants circulated with drinks, and guards stood at obvious positions, trying to look decorative rather than threatening. Thomas and his team approached from the north, using terrain and darkness to mask their movement, and waited for Martinez to create the distraction. The distraction came in the form of a fire, nothing serious, just a tool shed on the property's edge catching flame with suspicious speed. Guards rushed to contain it, guests moved to safer distance, and in the confusion Thomas led Elena and Cooper through a servant's entrance she'd identified during her reconnaissance. They moved through the darkened halls of Dalton's house, gun in Thomas's hand. Elena's presence a reminder that this violence served protection rather than destruction. The office was on the 2nd floor, door locked but not guarded thanks to the chaos outside. Cooper picked it in seconds, skills learned from harder times, and they slipped inside. Elena moved straight to the painting she'd noted, lifted it aside, and revealed the safe behind. Thomas worked the combination, numbers extracted from a drunk accountant by Josiah Webb's network, and felt the lock disengage with a soft click. Inside were ledgers and correspondence, documents that mapped years of systematic crime. Thomas began stuffing them into a saddlebag, while Elena photographed pages using a small camera borrowed from the territorial surveyor. They worked in frantic silence, knowing every second increased their risk of discovery, until voices in the hallway froze them mid-motion. Marcus Dalton himself, returning to his office with Vernon Cross and 2 guards. Thomas weighed their options in the space of a heartbeat, calculated odds and outcomes, and made the decision he'd been trained to make. He positioned himself at the door, gun ready, while Elena and Cooper moved to the window. If violence came, he would buy them time to escape even if it cost him everything. The door opened, and Dalton's eyes went wide, shock transforming to rage as he recognized Thomas and understood the betrayal. Cross reached for his weapon, but Thomas was faster. Gun leveled, and voice cold with authority. He told them to stand down, to let his companions finish their work, and warned that the first man to move would die before drawing breath to shout. But Dalton wasn't built for surrender. His empire had been constructed on the assumption of untouchable power, and he lunged for the door to raise alarm. Thomas fired, not to kill but to stop, the bullet taking Dalton through the shoulder and spinning him into Cross. The guards rushed forward and Thomas met them with controlled violence, fists and pistol butt, years of experience overwhelming their clumsy assault. Elena had the documents, had the evidence that would destroy Dalton's conspiracy. But Cooper was struggling with one of the guards near the window. Thomas crossed the room in 3 strides, pulled the guard off Cooper, and threw him toward Dalton with enough force to tangle them both. He shouted for Elena to go, to get the documents to safety, but she stood frozen at the window staring at something below. Sheriff Hutchins had arrived with 12 men, all armed and forming a perimeter around the house. The distraction had worked too well, drawing attention rather than simply diverting it, and now they were trapped inside a hostile stronghold with stolen documents and wounded enemies. Thomas felt the old calculations running, measuring exits and defenses, and came up with nothing that didn't end in their capture or death. Elena grabbed his arm, pulled him from the window, and spoke with urgent clarity. There was another way out, a servant's staircase leading to the wine cellar. From there, tunnels to the root cellar outside the main house. She'd seen them during her reconnaissance, marked them as potential escape routes. Thomas looked at Cooper, at the documents, at Elena's fierce determination, and nodded once. They ran through darkened hallways while shouts erupted behind them, Dalton raising alarm and Hutchins's men storming the house. The servant's staircase was narrow and steep, barely visible in the dim light, but Elena led them down, with confidence born from memory. Behind them, footsteps pounded, commands shouted, the machinery of pursuit grinding into motion. The wine cellar was cool and dark, rows of bottles casting strange shadows. Elena found the tunnel entrance behind a massive rack, a wooden door meant for discreet deliveries of contraband during the valley's lawless early years. Thomas helped her pull it open while Cooper watched their backs, gun steady despite the chaos closing in. They emerged from the root cellar into cold darkness, the sounds of pursuit momentarily muffled by earth and stone. Their horses were hidden a quarter-mile away, beyond the immediate perimeter Hutchins had established, but crossing that distance meant exposure and risk. Thomas took point. Elena and Cooper flanking with the saddlebag of evidence secured between them, and they moved through shadows like ghosts fleeing judgment. A guard spotted them near the horse pasture, raised his rifle and shouted warning. Thomas fired first, a shot that took the man in the leg rather than the chest. Old instincts tempered by Elena's influence. They ran while alarm spread, guards converging on their position, and reached the horses with seconds to spare. Thomas boosted Elena into her saddle, saw Cooper mount beside her, and felt a bullet tear through his side as he grabbed his own reins. The wound was serious, familiar pain blooming as he hauled himself onto his horse. But there was no time for assessment or treatment. They rode hard into darkness, gunfire pursuing them, and Thomas focused on staying conscious while Elena led them toward prearranged rendezvous. Behind them, the Dalton ranch erupted in chaos, men shouting and horses thundering in pursuit. But the darkness was absolute, and the valley terrain favored those who knew its secrets. They reached the rendezvous, a canyon 2 hours north, and found Martinez waiting with fresh horses. The cattle raid had succeeded. Hundreds of head driven into neighboring territory where honest lawmen had documented the forged brands. The financial raid had also worked. Cross's office ransacked and records seized. 3 prongs of their plan had succeeded, but the cost was becoming clear. Thomas slid from his saddle, weakness flooding through him as blood soaked his shirt. This was the second time he'd been shot in Elena's presence, the second time she'd need to decide whether his life was worth saving. He looked up at her, saw the fear flash across her face before determination replaced it, and knew that whatever came next, they would face together. Elena worked on his wound while Cooper and Martinez stood guard. The bullet had gone through clean, a blessing. But the bleeding was severe, and infection a certainty without proper care. They couldn't return to the forge. Hutchins would have it surrounded, couldn't seek help in town where Dalton's influence ran deep. Their only option was to push north, toward the territorial capital, where the federal marshal was due to arrive within the week. But Thomas couldn't ride. Not like this. Not with consciousness fading and fever already taking hold. Elena made a decision that would have seemed impossible months ago. She ordered Cooper and Martinez to take the documents and ride hard for the capital. They would deliver the evidence, alert the marshal, and bring back help. She would stay with Thomas, hide him until he could ride or help arrived, whichever came first. The men protested, argued that leaving Elena alone with a wounded man was suicide, but she was adamant. The documents mattered more than individual lives. Miguel had taught her that through his sacrifice, and she wouldn't let Thomas's wound or her fear compromise their mission. She gave them coordinates for a canyon she knew, a place her father had shown her as a child, and sent them riding into darkness with the future of the valley in their saddlebags. Then she was alone with Thomas, with the man she'd saved twice now, with feelings she'd refused to name until they could no longer be denied. She bandaged his wound with strips torn from her shirt, gave him water from her canteen, and made a travois from pine branches to transport him to that hidden canyon. It took her hours to move him, dragging the travois through rough terrain. But Elena had been forged in hardship and refused to yield. The canyon was exactly as she remembered, narrow and protected, with a spring providing fresh water and enough cover to hide them from casual pursuit. Elena made camp, started a fire small enough to avoid detection, and settled into the work of keeping Thomas alive through another night. She cleaned his wound, watched for signs of infection, and sat beside him, whispering stories about her father and Miguel, about the life she'd built from ruins, about the future she wanted them to survive to see. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, fever dreams mixing with reality. He saw Emma and his son, the family he'd lost to illness. But instead of grief, their memory brought strange peace. They would have wanted him to find this, to find Elena, and redemption and purpose beyond mere survival. When he surfaced from delirium, her face was always there, anchoring him to life with stubborn refusal to let him drift away. 3 days passed in that canyon, while Thomas fought fever and Elena kept watch. She hunted for food, changed his bandages, and held him through the worst of his delirium. On the 4th day, his fever broke, weakness remaining but clarity returning. And he woke to find Elena asleep beside him, her hand still holding his. He studied her face. This woman who'd saved him twice and transformed him completely, and understood that everything he'd been before was simply preparation for this moment. Elena woke to find him watching her, saw the clarity in his eyes, and felt tears she'd refused to shed finally break through. She'd been terrified, more frightened than when facing Dalton's men or planning raids, because losing Thomas would mean losing the possibility of something beyond survival. She kissed him, desperate and grateful, and he held her with arms that were weak but absolute in their certainty. They talked through the afternoon, honest conversation about feelings long suppressed. Thomas told her he loved her, that she'd given him a life worth living, and asked if she could imagine building something together when this was finished. Elena answered by describing the forge, by talking about teaching him the craft, about creating things together rather than destroying. She'd been alone so long, had armored herself against hope, but Thomas had breached those defenses and shown her that new beginnings were possible. Cooper and Martinez returned on the 10th day, accompanied by Federal Marshal James Blackwood and a contingent of territorial soldiers. They'd delivered the evidence. Blackwood had reviewed it with growing fury, and warrants had been issued for Dalton, Cross, and Sheriff Hutchins. The marshal had come personally, unwilling to delegate justice in a case involving local corruption, and his presence meant the conspiracy's days were finished. Blackwood interviewed Thomas and Elena in that hidden canyon, took their statements with careful notes, and examined Thomas's wound with a soldier's understanding of violence and its consequences. He was a weathered man in his 50s, gray-bearded and scarred, and his eyes held the weight of seeing too much frontier brutality. He told them plainly that their evidence was damning, that convictions were certain, but that the process would be dangerous. Dalton wasn't going quietly. He'd fortified his ranch and gathered his men, turning his home into a stronghold against justice. Hutchins had fled town, abandoning his post rather than face arrest, and Vernon Cross was rumored to be organizing armed resistance. The valley was on the brink of open warfare between those who'd profited from corruption and those who'd suffered under it. Blackwood asked Thomas to serve as guide and tactical advisor, to use his knowledge of Dalton's operation to help plan the marshal's assault. It meant returning to violence, meant putting Elena at risk. But Thomas understood that some fights couldn't be avoided. He agreed, on the condition that Elena remain in protective custody until the situation was resolved. She protested, argued that she'd earned the right to see this through, but Thomas was immovable. He told her she'd given him everything, purpose and redemption and love, and he refused to let the final confrontation take that away. Elena heard the finality in his voice, understood this was his line, and reluctantly accepted. But she made him promise to return, to survive whatever came next, because their future was too important to sacrifice on the altar of vengeance. The marshal's forces moved on Dalton's ranch 3 days later. 40 soldiers and deputized citizens against perhaps 20 defenders. Thomas rode with them, providing intelligence about defensive positions and likely tactics, while Elena remained at the territorial capital under guard. He thought about her constantly, about the life they would build once justice was served, and that hope kept him focused through the coming violence. Dalton's men opened fire as the marshal's forces approached, turning the ranch into a battlefield. Thomas led a flanking maneuver that cut off their retreat. His old skills deployed one final time in service of law rather than corruption. The fight lasted 2 hours, ending when Dalton himself emerged under white flag to negotiate surrender. But Vernon Cross had other plans, slipped away during the chaos, and was spotted riding hard toward town with 6 men. Thomas understood immediately. Cross was going to destroy evidence, burn records, maybe take hostages to bargain for escape. The marshal couldn't spare forces from securing Dalton's ranch, which meant Thomas volunteered to pursue with a small team. Cooper and Martinez rode with him, these men who'd become allies and friends through shared danger. They pushed their horses hard, covering ground faster than Cross expected, and caught up to him at the burned remains of Elena's forge. Cross had intended to eliminate any remaining evidence, any final proof of his crimes, but found the forge cold and empty. The confrontation happened in that space where Thomas's transformation had begun, where Elena had chosen to save rather than condemn. Cross recognized Thomas, sneered about betrayal and wasted potential, and reached for his weapon believing the former gunman would hesitate. But Thomas didn't hesitate, didn't allow old loyalties or memories to slow his hand, and fired with precision that left Cross wounded and disarmed. The territorial governor himself presided over the trials, 3 weeks of testimony that laid bare the full scope of Dalton's conspiracy. Thomas testified about his own crimes, accepted responsibility, and offered evidence that convicted the men who'd commanded him. His testimony was devastating, precise, and unflinching. And when he spoke about Miguel Vasquez, there wasn't a soul in the courtroom who doubted his remorse. Elena sat in the gallery every day, her presence a reminder of what redemption looked like. She watched Thomas face judgment with the same courage he'd shown facing bullets, and understood that this was the hardest part of his transformation. The governor offered him clemency in exchange for cooperation, recognition that Thomas's evidence was essential to securing convictions. But Thomas refused any deal that didn't include serving time for his false testimony. The governor paused, considered, and handed down a sentence that balanced justice with mercy. 5 years for conspiracy and false testimony, with credit for time served and possibility of parole for continued cooperation. Dalton received 20 years, Cross 15, and Sheriff Hutchins, caught trying to flee to Mexico, got 12. The machine that had consumed the valley was dismantled piece by piece through legal process rather than vigilante justice. Thomas accepted his sentence without complaint, told Elena through prison bars that 5 years was a small price for the life she'd given him. She visited weekly, brought news of the valley's recovery and the forge she was rebuilding. The territorial government had compensated families who'd lost property, restored land titles, and appointed honest lawmen to replace Hutchins's corrupt regime. Spring was coming to the valley in ways both literal and metaphorical. 3 years passed before Thomas walked free, early parole granted for exceptional cooperation, and demonstrated rehabilitation. The warden who released him was the same man who'd presided over Miguel Vasquez's imprisonment, and he spoke words weighted with institutional guilt. The system had failed Miguel, had failed dozens of innocent men, but Thomas's choice to expose that failure had begun the process of reform. Thomas stepped into sunlight a different man than the one who'd collapsed bleeding at Elena's door. Prison had given him time to read, to think, to fully reckon with the harm he'd caused and the life he wanted to build. He'd learned blacksmithing from an old convict, developed skill with hammer and forge that made him useful rather than dangerous. When Elena met him at the prison gates, her smile held 4 years of waiting and absolute certainty that the wait had been worthwhile. The ride back to the valley was filled with conversation about everything and nothing. Comfortable silences broken by laughter and plans. Elena told him about the forge, now expanded into a proper workshop employing 3 apprentices. She'd become a respected member of the community, her testimony during the trials earning admiration, and the business her father had built was thriving in ways he'd never imagined. Thomas told her about prison life, about the men he'd helped, about the letters he'd written to his sister that had finally been answered. His sister wanted to visit, to meet the woman who'd transformed her brother, and Thomas spoke about family reunions with hope rather than shame. He'd spent 3 years earning the right to face his past, and now the future stretched before him full of possibility. They arrived at the forge to find it decorated for celebration. Josiah Webb and Cooper and Martinez waiting with dozens of valley residents. A banner proclaimed, "Welcome home." And Thomas felt overwhelming gratitude for these people who'd forgiven him when he'd barely forgiven himself. Webb spoke about redemption as a journey rather than destination, about how Thomas's courage in facing justice had helped heal wounds throughout the community. The celebration lasted into evening, food and music and stories shared beneath stars. Thomas stood apart at one point, watching Elena laugh with neighbors, and marveled at the life she'd built from the ashes of her grief. She'd taken every hardship, every loss, and forged them into strength and purpose. He'd been just one piece of iron she'd shaped, but perhaps the most important. Elena found him in the quiet darkness, took his hand, and led him into the forge where their story had begun. The fire was banked but warm, tools arranged with the same precision her father had taught her. And in that space, she asked Thomas the question she'd been holding for 3 years. Would he marry her? Would he help her build not just horseshoes and wagon wheels, but a family? Would he choose the life they'd fought so hard to make possible? Thomas answered by pulling a ring from his pocket. Simple iron he'd forged in prison, shaped during countless hours imagining this moment. He'd been saving it, polishing it, investing it with every promise of the man he'd become. He slipped it onto her finger, felt her arms wrap around him, and understood that this was what redemption truly meant. Not erasure of the past, but transformation of the future. They married in Josiah Webb's church 1 month later, the same room where they'd planned their desperate raid against Dalton. The pews were filled with people whose lives had been changed by their courage, ranchers who'd kept their land, families who'd avoided Cross's violence, and children who'd grown up in a valley made safer by their sacrifice. Webb performed the ceremony with tears in his eyes, spoke about love forged in hardship, and pronounced them husband and wife to thunderous celebration. Thomas and Elena built a life that honored both their pasts while embracing their future. They worked the forge together, his strength complementing her precision, creating works of utility and beauty. They became known throughout the territory for the quality of their craft, for horseshoes that never threw, for tools that lasted generations. But more than that, they became known for their integrity, for the way they treated workers and customers with equal respect. A daughter arrived 2 years after their wedding, named Emma after Thomas's first wife, a gesture of healing rather than replacement. The child had her mother's determination and her father's quiet strength. And watching Elena teach little Emma to work the bellows filled Thomas with joy he'd never imagined possible. He'd been given a second chance at family, at fatherhood, and this time he would be present for every moment. The The years that followed were marked by steady growth rather than dramatic upheaval. Thomas became a respected voice in Valley affairs, his past acknowledged but not defining, his judgment sought by those facing difficult decisions. He helped establish programs for men leaving prison, offered employment and training, and worked to ensure the justice system served rehabilitation rather than merely punishment. Elena expanded the forge into a training center, teaching young people the blacksmith's craft, preserving skills her father had mastered. She became known as much for her teaching as her work, patient and demanding in equal measure, and her apprentices carried the Vasquez name with pride. The forge became a gathering place, somewhere people came not just for horseshoes, but for wisdom and community. They visited Miguel's grave together each year on the anniversary of his death, brought flowers and stories about the valley he'd died to protect. Thomas spoke to the stone marker, told Elena's brother about the life they'd built, about little Emma and the forge and the justice that had finally been served. Elena held Thomas's hand through these visits, her grief transformed into something gentler, into memory, rather than anguish. Josiah Webb grew old alongside them, his church becoming the spiritual center of a community rebuilt on honesty rather than corruption. He baptized Emma and the 3 children who followed, performed weddings and funerals, and never tired of telling the story of Sarah and Cole. No, he'd correct himself with a smile, of Elena and Thomas. The story of how love and courage had defeated a conspiracy, how redemption was possible even for those who'd strayed farthest from righteousness. Cooper and Martinez established their own ranch, using compensation from the territorial government to build something lasting. They remained close friends with Thomas and Elena, their children growing up together, their families bound by shared history and mutual respect. The bonds forged in that desperate time never weakened, instead deepening through years of peaceful prosperity. Vernon Cross died in prison, bitter and unrepentant to the end. Marcus Dalton served his sentence and emerged a broken man, his empire dissolved and his reputation destroyed. He left the valley immediately upon release, unable to face the community he'd tried to control. Sheriff Hutchins never finished his sentence, killed in prison by someone whose family he'd ruined through false testimony. The valley itself transformed, grew prosperous, as honest governance replaced corruption. New families arrived, drawn by reputation for justice and opportunity, and the population doubled within a decade. The railroad came through, bringing commerce and connection. But the community maintained its character. They'd fought too hard for integrity to surrender it to greed or convenience. Thomas's sister finally visited when Emma was 5, brought her own children to meet their uncle and his family. The reunion was tearful and joyful, old wounds acknowledged and forgiven, and Thomas introduced her to the woman who'd saved him in every sense of the word. His sister embraced Elena, thanked her for giving back the brother she'd thought lost forever, and the 2 women became fast friends bonded by love for the same complicated man. As Thomas approached 50, his hair silver and hands scarred by forge and life, he would sometimes stand in the doorway of their home, watching Elena teach their children. In those moments he would remember the man he'd been, bleeding and desperate at her door, and marvel at the journey that had brought him here. He'd been offered redemption by a woman who had every right to let him die, and he'd spent every day since earning that gift. Elena would catch him watching, would smile with the knowing intimacy of decades shared, and remind him that redemption wasn't something earned and finished, but something lived daily through choices and actions. They'd both been broken by loss, both scarred by injustice, but together they'd forged something stronger than either could have built alone. The valley remembered their story, passed it down through generations as proof that people could change, that courage mattered, that justice was worth fighting for even against impossible odds. Children grew up hearing about the blacksmith who'd faced down corruption, about the gunman who'd chosen redemption over death, about how spring always followed winter for those brave enough to endure. Thomas Mercer died peacefully at 72, surrounded by Elena and their children and grandchildren. His last words were thanks. Gratitude for the life he'd been given, for the woman who'd refused to let him waste it. Elena held his hand as he passed, felt his final breath, and knew that their story had been complete. He'd lived the redemption she'd offered him, had become the man she'd always seen beneath the scars and mistakes. She continued working the forge another decade, teaching and creating, keeping alive the craft and the memory. When her own time came, she went peacefully, surrounded by the family they'd built and the legacy they'd forged together. Her apprentices carried on the work, maintained the standards, and told newcomers about the woman who'd saved a dying man and transformed a valley. The forge still stands today, maintained by the Vasquez Mercer family, a monument to the truth that redemption is real, that love can triumph over hatred, that courage is found not in the absence of fear, but in acting despite it. Visitors come from across the territory to see where the story began, to touch the anvil Elena's father used, to stand in the space where transformation occurred, and on quiet evenings when the forge fire burns low, some say you can still feel their presence. Elena's determination and Thomas's gratitude, the spirits of two people who proved that no one is beyond saving, that spring always comes, and that the hardest iron, when properly forged, becomes the strongest steel. The valley they saved continues to thrive, built on foundations of justice and integrity they fought to establish. Their story is taught to children as proof that individual courage matters, that standing against corruption is worth the cost, that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to seek it. And in the cemetery where they rest side by side, beneath stones that bear their names and the dates of lives well lived, the inscription reads simply, "They forged justice from grief and love from ashes." A testament to two souls who found each other in darkness, who built light through determination and sacrifice, and who proved that the greatest transformations happen not in moments of triumph, but in the daily choice to be better than yesterday. Their legacy lives not in monuments or grand gestures, but in the smiths who still learn the craft, in the valley that remains prosperous and just, in the families who build honest lives on the foundation they established. Thomas and Elena's story reminds every generation that change is possible, that past mistakes need not define future possibilities, and that love, when forged in the fires of hardship, becomes unbreakable. The spring they fought for arrived, literal and metaphorical, and continues blooming through the work of those who remember their sacrifice. The valley stands as proof that ordinary people facing impossible odds can triumph when they refuse to surrender, when they choose courage over comfort, when they understand that some things, justice, integrity, love, are worth any price. And so their story ends where it began, in a forge where iron becomes steel, where weakness becomes strength, where a dying man found salvation and a grieving woman found purpose, where two broken souls forged something eternal from the fragments of their shattered pasts, proving that redemption is real, and that spring, always, eventually, comes. And there you have it. Thomas and Elena's journey from enemies to allies, from broken souls to beloved partners, from darkness to redemption. A story that proves the frontier wasn't just about survival, but about the courage to become something better than what we were. If this tale moved you, if you felt the weight of their struggle and the triumph of their love, show your support by hitting that like button. It means the world to us and helps these stories reach others who need to hear them. Comment below and tell us where you're listening from. What part of the world calls to you the way the frontier called to Thomas and Elena? We love building this community of story lovers from every corner of the globe. If you haven't subscribed yet, you're missing out on new Western tales every day. Stories of redemption, revenge, survival, and the indomitable human spirit. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the Wild West. And don't ride off into the sunset just yet. We've got another powerful story waiting for you. Click the video on your screen right now. Another tale of the frontier. Another journey into the heart of what it means to be human when the world strips away everything except what truly matters. Until next time, may your own forge burn bright. May your redemption be hard-won and genuine. And may you always find the courage to face another dawn. Now, click that next story, and let's ride again.